Deputy Owen Murphy. Deputy, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Cardiff. You're very welcome. I just want to ask, just briefly, in the years prior to 2008 and the onset of the crisis, did you ever give any advice to the Minister or the Government on the risks associated with the travelling of public expenditure, the growing dependency on construction-related economic activity and tax revenues?
Me personally, or the department?
You personally.
I don't recall, Deputy. I might have, but remember that for most of the time, I wouldn't have been the person who was dealing with who was given the fiscal advice. So in the department, the tax unit that I dealt with was dealing mostly with specific taxes and even tax packages, but not with how they tie into the overall fiscal balance for that year. That was in a different unit and a different section. So it wouldn't be that I wouldn't be unaware or that I wouldn't be coordinating with those people, but it wouldn't be me most of the time who would be giving that advice. Just going back to 2004, though, then when I was in the financial sector unit and the credit growth was starting to take off, no, I didn't. I never gave at that point in time a specific advice that said, look, this credit growth is now a real systemic problem. Probably it was a bit too early to say that anyway, but I did have a little bit of a concern that, to be honest, that what I was running was a factory. It was a legislation factory. You don't see most of it because most of it actually is in transposition of directives and so forth. So it doesn't come to the House except to the relevant committee. So you won't see it. But there's a huge factory job that goes on in that part of the Department of Finance of producing legislation. And in that unit then there was one or two people whose job was a holdover from pre-EMU, which was to sort of keep an eye on markets and credit growth and so forth. And I didn't really think that we were doing that analysis job. We weren't doing it justice because the unit was doing other things. So I arranged at the time that unit would be moved into the economics area so that credit would be seen, and I think it later was, in fairness, it was sort of wrapped into overall economic analysis. I then went off elsewhere to a different job. So the answer is no, but it wouldn't necessarily have been me. But if you read the Wright report, there's a fairly detailed exposition of what advice was given and wasn't given. And I was on the management committee, so if I had a sense that there was something being done seriously wrong or seriously inadequately, I would have said so. I don't remember saying so, which makes me think I didn't have that sense.
Is it fair to say then that the management committee in the department wasn't aware of the systemic risks that were building up in the system through that period?
Oh no, hang on. We were the system. The management committee was mostly a coordination committee, but the managers, the senior managers, were aware of systemic risks building up, did bring them to notice, did explicitly advocate significantly tighter fiscal policy than was decided by government, and their advice was not followed. According to Mr. Wright, we should have not just given the advice when we did, but we should have banged the table more, should have been more strident or more insistent or whatever, even more public. But that wasn't the system we were operating at the time. So there was explicitly advice, and there was explicitly advice on these kind of imbalances, but there wasn't a kind of strident opposition, internal opposition, if you like. There also wasn't, and to be clear, there was not a sense of a looming crisis of the scale we reached.
It's still, just to clarify, the advice that was being provided to the political level wasn't taken up at the political level. And then do you accept the criticisms in the Wright report on the role of the department in that budgetary process in those years?
Well, I commissioned the Wright report, and formally the Minister did, but it was pretty much entirely my initiative, which he was very willing to take up. I wanted a better Department of Finance, and I didn't want what happened to be repeated. And that being the case, I'm hardly likely to say, well, I disagree with the criticism. I wanted criticism because without criticism you can't have improvement. So yes, I agree with him. I don't think yet that our system is developed in the way that it could be that would allow us to do what he says. For example, he wants a more open and expansive Department of Finance, which would indeed, where the Secretary General would be making his own economic statement on a yearly basis. I haven't yet had the sort of understanding that the political system would run with that, even while I was still in the department. But what the political system does accept and has run with is a more public department, where, for example, individual economists are doing papers and so forth in public, where I notice my sort of half successor, Robert Watt, who took over half of my old bailiwick, is much more regularly in the public than I would have been. Maybe it was, I suppose when I was Secretary General there wasn't much time to be doing speeches, but so there is movement in that direction, but the political system even now, I'd say, would resent a sort of a public internal opposition that on the one hand was working with it, and on the next day was making a statement that said, in public, that says, by the way, Minister didn't do this when I told him.
I might come back to that a little later. I'm running out of time, Mr. Cardiff. I just wanted to follow up a couple of things that weren't clear from the documents you presented to us. The Sunday cabinet meeting, the day before the guarantee was made, was any decision taken at that cabinet meeting? Because you provided in documentation a quote from John Gormley, who was in cabinet at the time. The arrangement had been made the previous Sunday, right? And we had gone into that in quite a bit of detail and said, yes, this was the expert advice to go down the guarantee route. So was a decision made the day before, on the 28th, on the Sunday?
Well, see, John Gormley seems to have said that. Mm-hmm. And knowing the guy, that was straight down the line exactly what he recalls. But there was no formal decision, because that would have been we would have received that. And if there was an informal decision, that wasn't, we weren't told that. But the government decisions tend not to be informal. It's either a decision or it's not.
Would the expertise have been in the room on the Sunday to kind of come to even an informal decision? I know I've left the civil service, but you never get a civil servant to say that the government isn't competent to make the government decisions. I'm not asking that question. When you look at the people who were in government buildings the night of the guarantee, were they at the cabinet meeting attending on the day before?
No, there was the cabinet meeting on the day before was, I think, explicitly to discuss the budget which had been advanced. So it wasn't ever, so far as I know, intended to be a discussion of the guarantee. Indeed, just to underpin that, at the same time as that government meeting was happening, there were meetings happening, I presume at the same time. There was a very lengthy meeting in the NTMA that day where we were supposedly still working out the options. So it would not have made sense for that, for the government. There was no paper put to government about the guarantee or anything like it that day, because we had been instructed to meet the same day to finalise a range of options. So
it's unlikely then that the cabinet might have even made an informal decision on the Sunday, the day before the guarantee, to implement the guarantee.
It would seem unlikely, except for the fact that Mr. Gormley has said that at least a certain amount of, quite extensive, he says, discussion had happened. Mm-hmm. So, and all I did is I put it out because I don't know the answer. But I mean, thankfully that's your job.
Okay, thank you. Just to move on then to the next day, and you said in your report, thank you, Chair, on page 59, you say, but once the main decision to grant the broad guarantee had been made, the level of movement in and out of rooms and corridors went up considerably. There was a lot to be arranged, including preparations had to be made for an incorporeal government meeting, a consultation of government members, and a decision to be taken by telephone. Was a decision made at that point or not? Essentially, I mean, substantively.
Well, no, there were two decisions that night. The first one was to recommend something to government, and the second was the government's decision itself. So, I mean, you couldn't. Well, it depends how you look at it, Deputy. If you think that when a minister, a Taoiseach, and an Attorney General come to a conclusion it's likely to be carried by the Cabinet, then we were at that point before the Cabinet was rung. But they were called, they were each advised of what was being done, and they could each have queried it. But realistically, I mean, there's a sort of ministers occasionally get slated in the press. Why didn't you stop it? If the Taoiseach rings you and he says there's a big problem and we have to stop it and it's urgent, and by the way, this is what we're doing, you probably have to take it on trust. And also, in fairness to various political parties and so forth, the next day when the government came to them in the Dáil and said, we're going to have to do this, it's not really fair later to criticise them for saying, OK, when it's a crisis, you have to come behind something, and unless you're dead sure you're going to come behind the government. So this criticism of people for agreeing to the guarantee or not agreeing to the guarantee, or some people saying they did and some people saying they didn't, and some people saying on the day that they don't really agree but they're going to vote against it anyway. The truth is, the government presented, the Taoiseach and the Minister presented to the government and then to the general public and to the Dáil a problem and a proposed solution. In the event that they hadn't, in the event that the Dáil had voted against their proposed solution, we might have had a much bigger problem. There wasn't much choice for ministers at that point.
I just want to come back to the Cabinet, though, in terms of the level of information they were receiving at the time. Yes,
final question.
The concluding question. Because, as you say in your statement, that there was always going to be a meeting that day. Things were happening. Things have been happening over the weekend. I mean, it would have been possible for a Cabinet member to disagree with the decision if they weren't at the actual meeting at which the decision was arrived at.
Well, a very well personally informed Cabinet member could have said when he was phoned at 1 in the morning or whatever, 2 in the morning, whatever time it was they got to them, I don't like the look of that, I'm voting against.
This would have been over the phone to...
Over the phone.
To whom?
The phone call is... Civil servants don't usually get to see this, but I think the phone call is made by the Secretary-General to the government.
Okay.